Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to the Stanford Historical Society program on a biography of sandstone from Greystone Quarry to Stone River. I'm glad the rain let up just a little bit, enough for all of you to join us. It was pretty hairy out there this morning, but now the sun is shining so we can enjoy this wonderful talk with Charlie Junkerman. It's my great pleasure to introduce Charlie. He and I have actually traveled together in some of the wilds of Great Britain, looking at stone walls and just incredible stone. And hearing him talk about stone is very inspiring. So I'm really looking forward personally to hearing him talk about Stanford sandstone today. So I am Leslie Kim. I serve as co-chair of the program committee of the Stanford Historical Society, along with John, who's over there. Yep. And we are very pleased to welcome all of you here. We put these programs together with great care. There's a whole committee of people, probably about 12 or so folks, who deliberate and debate about all the different topics on Stanford history that we want to be able to share with you. So thank you to the people who volunteer on that committee, because there's a lot of time and love that goes into that. If you are not a member of the Stanford Historical Society, we greatly, greatly encourage you to join. We make these programs free for everyone, but we heavily rely on membership dues to make these programs happen. So if you enjoy what you've been hearing and what you hear today, we would greatly appreciate anything that you can contribute. And even if you're already a member, extra donations are always welcome. Our website, historicalsociety.stanford.edu, will give you plenty of resources. All right, so again, it's my great pleasure to welcome Charlie Junkerman here today. Charlie has had a very long career here at Stanford, spanning 4 decades. During that time, he has served in many different capacities, probably the most recent as Associate Provost and Dean of Continuing Studies, which he was in that position until 2020. Prior to that, he served in various roles, including the Assistant Dean of Undergraduate Studies, the Associate Director of the Humanities Center, and most importantly for us at the Historical Society, as President of the Historical Society. He continues to teach on topics on European and American literature, and also serves as a faculty leader on Alumni Association travel study trips, which we are very proud at SAA to have him do that. So without further ado, thank you. And please join me in welcoming Charlie Junkerman.
Thank you, Leslie. That's a nice introduction. And thanks to all my friends for coming here, and those of you who are not here but are on Zoom somewhere, thanks for taking the time to listen. Special thanks to my colleagues Sapna, Marfatia, Charlotte Glasser, Karen Bartholomew, and my good friends and colleagues at the Historical Society. I gave this talk a while ago, and some of my friends who have good memories, when I said, I gave this talk on January 24th, they said, did you already give that? It was a long time ago, but part of my thesis in talking about the stone, as you'll gather, is about metamorphosis and about change. Everything changes, and this talk has changed a lot. And I'm not saying it's better or worse, but it is different. So thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoy what I plan to do over the next 45 minutes, which is to offer you a biography of Stanford sandstone. And I chose that word advisedly. Biography means the writing of a life, literally, because I think the Stanford sandstone has, in fact, had a life. It clearly had a beginning. It hasn't had an end. It won't have an end. Nothing perishes. But it's had many episodes and many chapters. It has a plot. And that's what I'm going to try to trace out for you in these next 45 minutes, right? So the premise, again, the premise is that stone, we know stone is inorganic, but it's never static or inert. It's always on its way, arriving from unimaginably ancient sources, and like everything, every physical thing in the universe, inevitably becoming something else, carried by the sublimely slow river of time. And I think this was an apprehension that Andy Goldsworthy shared in the making of Stone River in the year 2000. The sculpture, which many of you know, yes, out in front of the Cantor Center. It's interesting how many people who are old Stanford hands don't know it, because it is, as you know, at grade, and you can be 20 feet away from it and not notice it. It was commissioned in 2001 by donor Ruth Halpern, a longtime Stanford donor and trustee, to honor the presidency of Gerhard Casper. Right? So let's start the biography of the sandstone in that year, 2001, and in particular in August 2001, now I think probably inevitably in our minds associated with the trauma that was waiting for us in the following month of September. But in August 2001, it was just hot. And these 8 dry stone wallers Andy Goldsworthy brought with him from Britain were not used to this kind of heat. And they were under a tight schedule. They had only 3 weeks to build this sculpture that would ultimately weigh more than 130 tons and would use 6,500 stones. What made the work especially challenging is that Goldsworthy had 2 aesthetic goals in mind. The first one was he wanted the sculpture to be earthbound, right? So much so that it appeared to have been excavated out of the ground, with parts of it still buried. Right? At the same time, he wanted the 700 copestones to be level at grade, a perfect line, right? And in his words, though fashioned by stone, would be worked by light, that perfect line of copestones. And those guys did it. So dry stone walling. Dry stone walling is an ancient craft, not only in Britain and Ireland, there's plenty of it there, those of you who know those parts of the world, but around the world. And though it's simple to explain, right? The waller builds by stacking stones one on top of the other without the help of mortar. It's very hard to learn, to get the balance right, to keep the stack plumb, to find a pleasing composition. The Koreans have been masters of dry stone walling for centuries. And I forget when I took this picture. I think it was 2009 or something like that. I just can't get over it. Every time I look at it, it makes me almost swoon. It's so gorgeous. Look at that. And these are huge, huge stones. And they have a saying in Korea about the art of dry stone walling. They say it teaches the virtue of accommodation. The practice of dry stone walling teaches the virtue of accommodation, because every stone you set has to accommodate the eccentricities of the stone you've already placed, right? And as you build your wall, the Koreans believe, you are also practicing certain social virtues: patience, dependence, and acceptance. In this dry stone wall, now we're going to get to Goldsworthy. Andy Goldsworthy designed this wall for the sculpture garden at Storm King in New York. How many of you know the sculpture garden on the Hudson? Wonderful place to go. Back in, when was this, 1998. Not the very first wall he built, but this one. And he picks up on this notion of movement, right? The wall that took a walk in the woods. Also built with that social virtue of acceptance, because he knew that a lot of things could happen to that wall, especially in the portions where he built the wall right flush with the trunk of a tree and the tree is growing, right? So it's an acceptance of whatever happens, right? Not only the growth of trees, but the thawing, freezing of winter, and ice and snow is bound to change the wall. So we anthropomorphize in our lives many things, right? Animals, deer, bear, birds, right? Trees are easy, they kind of look like us. But walls, it's kind of hard for us, I think, to stretch our imagination and anthropomorphize a wall and imagine a wall walking, right? But Goldsworthy helps us. The first wall walking that he constructed was in 1990. in the Greystone Forest in the Lake District of England, right? Taking a wall for a walk. The last one he built for the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, 2019, actually does walk. The builders of this wall this was back a few years ago, 2019, what they would do is they would take 10 yards of stone from the back of the wall and move it to the front every 2 weeks, so that the wall would move. And it did move. It walked across a lawn. It jaywalked across a very busy street and up a hill. This is Andy with the donor, Isabel Sosland. Isabel Sosland walked up a hill, walked up a stairway, and into the museum, where it came to rest and stop, and it's there today. So back to our river, Stone River, our own wall. We all know from our visits to the Stone River that the play of light on the stone, not just the edge, but the entire piece, is an essential part of our experience. The sculpture changes with the seasons, the daily weather, and the time of day. It's oriented, not accidentally, east-west, like megalithic installations in Great Britain, and so that the sun follows its axis, rises in the east, sets in the west. And as the sun moves, the wall reveals different aspects of itself. In fact, in the dedication ceremony in January 2002, Goldsworthy said that he had spent hours that very day just watching the light change as the sun moved. The light, he said, brought out the energy in the stone. Now, this energy seemed like a valid enough metaphor, but the way he said it, kind of probing, tentative, suggested that he had something real in mind, that this was not just a figure of speech, that he'd actually seen something. Now, I remember the California painter Wayne Thiebaud saying one time that our great skill as human beings is to see what isn't there, or to imagine what we can't actually see. Richard Dawkins, in a wonderful short talk at a TED conference a number of years ago called The Universe is Queerer Than We Can Suppose, meditated on this narrow band of reality that we humans are equipped to see. Now, I had this queued up with his wonderful voice, and text didn't work, so you're going to have my Midwestern American voice read what you would have gotten from Richard Dawkins. But this is what Dawkins says. Science has taught us that apparently solid things like crystals and rocks are really almost entirely composed of empty space. So it would seem that the hardest, solidest, densest rock is really almost entirely space, broken only by tiny particles so widely spaced they shouldn't count. Why then do rocks look and feel solid, hard, and impenetrable? As an evolutionary biologist, I'd say this: our brains have evolved to help us survive within the orders of magnitude of size and speed which our bodies operate at. We never evolved to navigate in the world of atoms. If we had, our brains probably would perceive rocks as empty space. Rocks feel hard and impenetrable to our hands precisely because objects like rocks and hands cannot penetrate each other. It is therefore useful for our brains to construct notions like solidity and impenetrability because such notions help us to navigate our bodies through the middle-sized world in which we have to navigate. I love Richard Dawkins. I think it doesn't get any better than this, right? It's useful for our brains to construct notions like solidity and impenetrability. Right? I'm glad to have him. Now, Goldsworthy, no different from us, cannot see into stone, but he can imagine himself into it. like Barbara McClintock, the famous geneticist who worked on corn in the 1940s, and said all of her breakthroughs came from intuiting what it felt like to be corn. She said, I learned to lean into the kernel. So in works like these, which Andy calls energy stones, Goldsworthy leans in and intuits the radiating energy that pulses in and through and around a stone. Different color saturation there. Great, huh? Seamus Heaney says it well in his poem, Seeing Things. Nothing else, and yet in that utter visibility, the stone's alive with what's invisible. In Japan, there's a Shinto practice which is similar in its apprehension of energy circulating through the material world. When a rock, or sometimes a grand old tree, is intuited to be the location of powerful concentrations of energy, kami, the rock is wrapped with a ritual rice fiber rope, a shiminawa, right? Which is both an adornment, like a necklace, right? And it's not quite right, a warning, like yellow crime tape. Watch out, high voltage. This is a power place, right? It's not exactly right metaphor because the shiminawa doesn't warn you away, it in fact invites you in. Because the Shinto belief is that these great stones or trees are gates. They're openings, like torii gates, right? Opening into the vast and invisible, but profoundly real network of energy that connects all things, organic and inorganic. What Ralph Waldo Emerson memorably described as the vast flowing vigor that pervades the entire material universe. If you find an opening into this vast flowing vigor, in Shinto they say you have come home. Right? You feel yourself at one with all creation. You feel whole. Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher who you know believed that water was the essence of all things, would say, you are back in the flow. With the water for that. At the entrance to the famous passage grave in Newgrange in Ireland, there's this carved entrance stone, right? It's one of the masterpieces of European Neolithic art, and nobody knows for certain what those flowing spirals mean. But it's not too much of a stretch to imagine them, I believe, as symbols of the constant flow of energy. And here at the mouth of a grave passage of the cycles of life, not dead, but back in the flow. Here's a stone sculpture by a contemporary artist on the coast of Maine that picks up on the vocabulary of the torii gate, but fashions it in stone, inviting us, I suspect, to think twice about stone as itself a substance into which and through which we can pass. Kind of like Claire Fraser. Get that joke? No? Outlander? It's okay. It's a little dated. Okay, the other phenomenon that cannot be seen but in stone, but that is profoundly real, is time. Right? If you can lean into a stone like a scientist or an artist, you can intuit the vast dimensions of time through which it has traveled to become what it is. Again, at the dedication ceremony in January 2002, Goldsworthy spoke about this river of time. And this is what he said. He said, the stone at Stanford was once sand, and through the process of erosion will become sand once more. It was compressed into rock that was quarried and made into buildings, which were then damaged by earthquakes, pulled down, and stored. Movement and change are part of the material's nature and are qualities that I have drawn on in the making of Stone River. It's not a representation of a river. It is the river in stone. My use of the stone has, in some ways, returned the stone to earth, another leg of its journey. So let's take Goldsworthy's image of the river and follow it back to the literal rivers from the Eocene era, 30, 40 million years ago, that brought the grains of sand that eventually became our sandstone down from what was then a mountain range that didn't look much like the Sierras, but is where the Sierras are geographically today, the same place. All of California, which wasn't California, all the land west of that mountain range was indeed underwater, right, on the western slope. And rivers draining this range cut through the granite, picked up chunks of granite that had been broken off in seasonal freezing and thawing, which in turn were broken down further into cobbles, then pebbles, then sand, mainly quartz and feldspar. Probably the river that carried our sand out of the mountains and into the sea carried it into a deep marine canyon like this one in Monterey Bay, right? Cutting through the continental shelf, transporting the sand deeper into deeper ocean, right? Now, over millions of years, these beds of sandy material built up on top of each other, grew to be many kilometers thick, right? And the pressure of the upper layers compressed those beds below, forming rock. This is the process known as lithification, right? Then, approximately 8 million years ago, the Farallon plate began to slip under the North American plate. And I don't know who told me this, but it's one of those facts that's stuck in my mind and I'll never let it go, that the tectonic plates move at the same rate our fingernails grow. Talk about vast, vast rivers of time. Started to move under the North American plate very slowly, lifting those shelf sediments, like our sandstone, above the water and forming a series of parallel ridges and valleys that we know as the Coast Range, right, today. In this range, south of present-day San Jose, is a small ridge known as the Santa Teresa Hills. They contain a generous deposit of what geologists call quartzo-feldspathic sandstone. Right? Here's what the hills look like today. Some of you may know the Santa Teresa Hills. Yep, it's a little obscure, but you know, it's worth a visit. Yeah. There's still active discussion among geologists about how old the sandstone is in this spur. One of the ways that geologists use to date things like this is the fossil record. But the fossil record is really sparse in this sandstone deposit. In fact, all the stone that was cut out of the Santa Teresa Hills and used in the construction of Stanford, there's only one fossil, and this is the fossil. It's called a turritella, right? It's apparently a very common sea snail, which doesn't help, right? And so geologists assume that this is the evidence they need to date our Stanford sandstone to about 34 million years ago. Right? So for 8 million years or so, tectonic plate movement, coastal ridge forming. So for about 8 million years or so, the sandstone in the Santa Teresa Hills lived a fairly quiet geologic life, right? Clearly undisturbed by humans, even undisturbed by animals for most of those years. Warming, cooling, ice ages, vegetation growing, dying back, laying down many feet of soil on top of the stone. Right? Then, in 1884, a fragile young man died of fever in Italy. And when the Stanfords decided to build a university on their horse farm as a memorial to their son, one of the first tasks was to find a source of building stone within a reasonable distance. Now, Stanford, being the senator, governor, and railroad man that he was, could have gone to the Sierras and gotten granite, and our university would be gray. Fortunately, he didn't. He went 25 miles south to the Santa Teresa Hills, where there was already a working quarry and a source of the most beautiful golden sandstone any of us know, right there. Now, not only was that sandstone closer than the granite in the Sierras, but it was much softer and easier to carve than granite ever would have been. And we get this, which astonishes us every time we look. So when Stanford arrived, started thinking about building the university in 1886, there had been a working quarry since the early 1870s in the Santa Teresa Hills. First opened by a gentleman named Levi Goodrich, and subsequently purchased by Jacob Pfeiffer, who bought it in 1876, and it was under his ownership when Stanford showed up and struck a deal with him. Now, being a railroad man, he had no trouble building a spur from the Santa Teresa Hills to the camp, to the building site on his horse farm, right? And being a senator, I suspect he had no trouble getting the right-of-way, although there wasn't much in between the horse farm and Santa Teresa Hills at the time. But to accommodate this hugely ambitious building project, the Stanfords undertook, the quarry had to hire on dozens of new workers. This project was so ambitious, you probably know this quip from David Starr Jordan. He said it was the second Stone Age building project that Jane and Leland together took on, starting in 1886. So at the quarry, at the Greystone Quarry, ironically named Greystone, the Greystone Quarry, the blasting, the hauling went on uninterruptedly until 1906 when the quarry closed. Now today you can visit the site of the quarry, and this is what you'll see. You won't actually see my son and wife, but you'll see what's left. You can see it was all filled in. This is near Almaden, those people know, near Almaden, just north of Morgan Hill. So built in with residential housing and remnants of the quarry still visible. Clearly this house was built right up against the quarry face, and these beautiful leftovers in their front yard. So back to 1886 and designing the university. Now, Leland Stanford, being who he was, could afford the best architects. And just look at this man and you know he gets what he wants. But one thing he couldn't get that he really wanted was the best architect in the country, in America, Henry Hobson Richardson, because Richardson had died in 1886. What he could get, here, I have this beautiful picture of Richardson, 345 pounds, and he died when he was 47, sadly, right? And, I mean, just his career wasn't even in the middle of his career. He was just taking off, and he was brilliant. But he had died, so out of reach for the Stanfords. But the Stanfords could get his three closest associates and proteges, Charles Shepley, Charles Rutten, and Charles Coolidge, the architectural firm Shepley, Rutten, and Coolidge, right? It was not a bad second choice, because these three gentlemen worked with Richardson on some of his most famous commissions. And I'll show you just a few of them. Trinity Church, Boston, which many of you know. And some people think this is the culmination of Richardson's career. It wasn't. It really was just the takeoff. It was the platform that launched in 1877. And those of you who know this church, it's just astonishingly beautiful. The Ames Memorial Library, he built a number of buildings in eastern and northeastern suburbs of Boston. And the Pittsburgh Allegheny Courthouse, granite now, not, so that's the gray granite that we could have had, right? These three buildings are some of the iconic examples of what's known to architectural historians as Richardsonian Romanesque, right? With features that were clearly carried over to Stanford's architecture. Broad openings, usually by way of rounded low arches, sturdy piers, massive walls, simple silhouettes, and sheltering roofs. Paul Turner, in his elegant little book, The Founders and the Architects, shows us how Shepley, Rutten, and Coolidge brought to the design of Stanford's main quad Richardson's signature style. In fact, plain variations on themes that had already worked well for them back east. And these are Paul Turner's comparisons, but they're brilliant, aren't they? Austin Hall, Harvard at the top, right, from the early 1880s, and the front of the quad, the north face of the quad. Same low arcade, same treatment, window treatment above. Trinity Church in Boston on the right, on your right, and Manchu, as it used to was, on the left when it had a tower. Pretty similar, huh? Yeah. You can see the genetic connection there. Paul Turner says that, this is his words, in the immediate aftermath of Richardson's death, his associates were still making perfect Richardsonian designs. And in this sense, Stanford University could almost be seen as a last posthumous design of his. And in fact, sometimes Jane Stanford would refer to the architect of her university as Richardson. But Stanford's buildings were not Richardsonian Romanesque solely, pure and simple. Leland Sr., in fact, stipulated that the design of the university acknowledge its geographic and cultural location. He wanted the university, in his words, to be an adaptation of the adobe buildings of California, an architecture distinctly Californian in character. And Charles Coolidge, the principal architect, regularly referred to the university's design as mission style with Romanesque details. So some of the borrowings from the missions you can see are the red tile roofs, single story horizontality, the deep arcades, shaded arcades, and the large open quadrangle, all features of California Spanish missions. Much of what we know and love about Stanford's architecture, Stanford's inner quad, is owing to these architects' fine work. But Stanford, being the man he was, and Jane being the woman, of course, had their say. If you look at this photo of the lane of the cornerstone, there's Leland and Jane in the middle, and this gentleman, see if I don't have a pointer, but you can, I see the guy in the bib overalls. To his left, that guy that's kind of blurred out, that's kind of out of focus, that's Charles Coolidge, looking, I think, really frustrated. Right? He complained in a letter back to his colleague, Frederick Law Olmsted, that, quote, both Mr. and Mrs. Stanford think the main entrance should be a large memorial arch with an enormously large approach. The very quietness and reserve which we like so much is what they want to get rid of. So, as we know, the Stanfords got their arch. And at the same time, Coolidge preserved much of that quietness, I think, in the side quads, the small side quads with their intimate scale and self-containment, very quiet, peaceful. The Stanfords also burnt out the best landscape architect in the country, Frederick Law Olmsted, no more than 30 years away from his triumph as the designer of Central Park in New York and the father of urban parks across the country. Olmsted and Richardson were close friends. In fact, they were neighbors in Brookline, Massachusetts. And it was Olmsted, as you probably all know, who conceived the master plan for Stanford University. And he worked on the design of the university up until 1893, when he died an untimely death in 1893, the same year that Leland Sr. died. So the work on the inner quad started in 1887. and was not complete when the university opened in 1891. Hundreds of unskilled laborers, along with dozens of masons and skilled stonecutters, mostly Italian immigrants, received the stone at the railhead where it had been sent from the quarry, where it was cut to size, dressed, and finished. Across the country in the 1880s and 1890s, there was a building boom going on, really all over, east and west, Midwest as well, Chicago certainly. And given the steady flow of immigrants, right, to the country in those decades, many of them skilled workers, there was no lack of laborers. Stanford, of course, could afford to keep them on site for many years. Right? And the work on the triumphal arch itself took 3 years. Here's the arch before the triumphal frieze was carved into it. Here it is with the frieze. Right? Just look at the amount of carving work that goes into that. And the frieze, as some of you all know, is the title is The Progress of Civilization in America. Jane and Leland on horseback, riding in front of a Central Pacific locomotive. The progress of civilization. The legend is that Jane Stanford would visit the work sites regularly with her brass-tipped umbrella and measure the carving to be sure that the carvers weren't sloughing off and that the relief was really deep. And it was. This is, as you know, some of the relief work on the arches outside of Memchu. Right. So the quarrymen at Greystone worked year after year and without pause because everybody loved this sandstone. I've had only 5 examples of 4, I think, of where else it's gone. It's gone into the Carson City Mint, 1870. It went into Lick Observatory, the first mountaintop observatory in the country. It went into the San Jose Public Post Office, which is now, as many of you recognize, part of the San Jose Museum of Art. And it went into the San Carlos train depot. How many of you know this beautiful little building? Oh, look at you all know this. Man, I stumbled upon it with some friends just, what was it, Christy, 2 years ago or something like that. And I looked at it and I said, wait a minute, that looks like, that's gotta be a knockoff. And in fact, it was. I did a little research on it. Here's a historic photograph. It just screams Richardsonian Romanesque, doesn't it? And in fact, Richardson was very active in the 1880s building depots, designing depots along the East Coast, especially the Boston-Albany line, and in the emerging suburbs. Every suburb wanted a distinguished, depot to be the official entryway to their, progressive and intelligent suburb. Now, this was built in 1893, and there's no record of who the architect was, but I think all signs lead to Charles Coolidge. Because in 1893, when Leland Stanford died, his will got complicated and was held up by legal arguments for about 4 or 5 years. And the building at the university itself came to a halt. So Coolidge had time on his hands, and he had workmen who wanted work. So my suspicion is that they took up this commission from the Southern Pacific to build a depot in San Carlos, just a few miles up the peninsula. When the suit cleared in 1897, Jane started building again, but unfortunately, not with the same quality standards that had prevailed under Leland. Some of the buildings she's responsible for. Leland Stanford Junior Museum. Now, you may recognize that this isn't what the museum looks like now, because those long wings came down in the 1906 earthquake. Before they came down, this was the largest museum in the world in terms of square footage. Ambitious. Beautiful church. The church, 1903. The men's gym, 1905, and I have a question mark because I'm not exactly sure. And the University Library, 1905. Now, these buildings and others that Jane was responsible for constructing enjoyed just a few brief years, in some cases just a few brief months, right, of architectural serenity, and then collapsed, literally pancaked when calamity struck on April 18th, 1906. The estimate for fixing the buildings in the inner quad, over which Leland oversaw the construction, was $70,000. Right? The estimate for fixing these buildings, the freestanding buildings outside the quad and the church, the estimate was $1,500,000. Just a mind-boggling amount of money in 1906. So the university, instead of investing in rebuilding these buildings, which were not well built to begin with, decided to just clear the sites, right? Clear the rubble. Right? That takes us to the next chapter in our sandstone. Where did that rubble go? Right? Where did it go? One answer to that, a quick answer to jump ahead, is to say it's all around us. Right? It's in the curbs in our walkways. This is in front of the faculty club. It decorates our courtyards. Right? And then houses in the faculty housing area, retaining walls, stairways, utilitarian things like a little dress stand, backyard garden bench. This is Midge Stewart's backyard. She's got some great pieces. This is Ron Ruth's backyard. The most bizarre barbecue I've ever seen in my life. And I have to say, sorry, Ron, I fiddled with the color on this, and I could never make it real. And I think maybe because this thing isn't real. But what a treasure trove he found in his backyard, right? Well, or previous owners clearly brought to them. Sometimes pieces, many of you in this room, I'm sure, have them as little garden decorations. This is Steve Boyd from the engineering school, and Steve and his wife, Anna Ranieri, live on San Juan Hill. And when they bought their house, the property was rather large and covered in ivy. Right? And Steve tells the story that he and his son got vigorous one summer and said, let's pull out the ivy. And they pulled out the ivy and found 2,000 pieces of sandstone from the quad. Like pieces like this gorgeous piece that he's leaning on. So it's all around us, right? It's all around us. The Romans called this architectural reuse of stone spolia, right? The spoils that get reused. And it has its own aesthetic, right? It's not trying to disguise its previous identity, but it draws attention to it. And it prompts us, I think, to contemplate both the durability and the ephemerality of all building projects. Here's an example from Trieste Cathedral, 11th century medieval cathedral, using Roman spolia, and not pretending that it's anything else, but taking that as an aesthetic statement of its vision. Now, the Stanford spolia did not go directly from the quad into our gardens, our neighbors' gardens. In the first place, most of the houses of those pictures I took weren't even built until the 1920s. In the second place, I suspect that rubble from an earthquake needed some time to soften, both figuratively and literally, before it could be used aesthetically, before it could be used decoratively. And we also know that there were some intermediate sites for the rubble. One of them was this Frenchman's Reservoir, is what it was called, Peter Coutts Lake, right? Which is now, as you know, Frenchman's Park there. A lot of the rubble from the quad got dumped into the lake. Right? And then I think, give it 20 years or so, the houses around that lake would have had access to spolia that wouldn't be that far to bring. And as I say, I think it would have softened a little bit. Old timers remember that a lot of the rubble got dumped in San Francisco Creek, just left. And I suspect it's from that site that this commercial complex downtown on Ramona Street, across the street from NOLA, you probably know it, beautiful, I think Pedro de Lemos design, complex of buildings. I suspect that these guys got their stone from San Francisco Creek, just a supposition. Right? Right. So the rest of the rubble, the university collected in various places and then consolidated their collection out on Old Page Mill Road in the 1980s in a place called the Boneyard. And here's the Boneyard. Right? And I first went out to the Boneyard in 2004. I'll show you a few more pictures of this. A marvelous place to go. And so these are 20 years old. I don't know I'm assuming that there's a lot more there now. Collections, columns, bases, capitals, all the rest. So I went out to the Boneyard in 2004 in preparation for an installation that I organized at the Cantor Center that I called 100 Stones, 100 Days. And the idea was very simple. And its success or failure was completely unpredictable. It was just a kind of a total gamble. But I thought it would be fun. So here's what I imagined I would do, and I did. So I selected 100 stones at the Boneyard, and we transported them. These guys did, nice guys. Brought them in to the gravel curtain outside the back, behind the Cantor Center. And here's Patience Young, many of you know Patience. And we had to line them up and count them like soldiers because we had to be sure we had 100, right? And the idea was to invite people, everybody, not just on campus, but anybody who was nearby and knew about it, to come and play, to arrange the stones, rearrange them, disarrange them, whatever. And people did. A lot of people came, all ages, various tastes, and played. Now, I often say in kind of a sappy way that I appreciate where I live, and I do. We've lived here for 42 years or something like that. And I love living in Palo Alto and spending my days at Stanford. But I think during these 100 days, my appreciation for where I lived got even more profound because people came and played. And I just shared a few 8 pictures or so of what people did with the stones. Almost. I remember one, and I would drop in every once in a while just to see what was happening because it was kind of exciting. And I remember I came one day and I heard this guy say on his phone, he said, yeah, no, I think the stones are too small to build an observatory. I thought, what? And so I said I couldn't help but overhear your comment. What did you have in mind? And this guy got to know Tim King. He was a graduate student in anthropology. And Tim's specialty, what he was working on, was Mayan astroarchaeology, right? Yeah. So Mayan observatories to follow the stars and do the solstice thing and all of that. Well, he did. He built one, small, a miniature one. But people just were so imaginative. This last one is Steve, one of the Cantor guards who got in on the act and loved the whole scene. Nice guy. So one of the things that surprised us as we went along, and then by the end, is that the 100 stones had become 250 stones. Not something we ever anticipated. But of course, sandstone is friable, right? And in the winter rain, it would break apart and break apart. And so for a while, here's the big stone, one of the big stones that just broke apart. People used the small pieces that had broken off in their assemblages. We'd give them something new to work with, like this. We didn't have stones that small to begin with, so you couldn't have built something like this. And just confessionally, I'll tell you, I built this because I was so upset. I came one morning to the site to see what was happening, and this was the only time in the 100 days, somebody had just trashed it. just scattered all the stones, kicked over all the assemblages. And I was so upset, I felt I needed to do something to calm myself down and restore the soul of the stones somehow. So I built this nest. And after stomping around a lot. So anyway, the stones started breaking down. Some of them got smaller and smaller, became cobbles again, pebbles, and then eventually sand. The survivors, we trucked back out to the boneyard, and we put them to bed. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to close with this little meditation. It's maybe a stretch, but it was something that just occurred to me, so it must have some kind of validity. When we took the stones back to the boneyard, I was reminded of a project I'd worked on maybe 12 years before, helping a Kiowa family from Oklahoma, a Kiowa Indian family, repatriate their ancestors' war shield from the Anthropology Museum at UC Berkeley. These folks had no way of dealing with an institution as intimidating as UC Berkeley, and so I said I would help them out. And Betty Washburn was the matriarch of the family, thought that shield of her ancestor, that war shield, was being held in some sort of a prisoner of war camp. That's how she imagined it, languishing. And what made her saddest, she said, that a shield wants to be danced. It was immobile, frozen, and it wanted to move. It was probably a stretch, I apologize, but I sort of thought of those stones on their way back to bed. Well, I thought we'd given them a good dance, right? We'd given them a good turn. So to wrap up, I'd like to quote Wayne Thiebaud again. One of our talents as human beings is to see what isn't there. It's a talent. It's hard, but it gets easier with practice. The Protestant theologian Teilhard de Chardin said this: "We live surrounded by ideas and objects infinitely more ancient than we can imagine, and yet, at the same time, everything is in motion." So I think on some days, we walk through the arcades of the quad, distracted, maybe late to class, texting, and we don't see. Some days we look around ourselves and we appreciate the extraordinary privilege of living our daily lives amidst such beautiful architecture and such warm stone. And then some days, often without plan or warning, something opens up, and for a moment, we see what isn't there and perceive that we are walking through ancient rivers of stone. And that's where I end. One little coda, completely unanticipated, but my good friend Joel Simon, and Joel thought he would be here today, but I bet he's zooming in, so hi, Joel, and thank you for what, oh, nope, he is here. Joel's up in the back. Thank you, Joel. So Joel sent me some New Year's photographs. Many of you know Joel's photographs, I'm sure, calendars and postcards and all the rest. He captures the spirit and the soul of this university, how it looks so beautifully that we think of him as Stanford's photo laureate. And he sent me this photograph, and he didn't know I was playing around with notions of stone and rivers or anything like that, but this is what he sent. Isn't that nice? Thank you, Joel. And with that coda, I'm now going to, we'll open up for Q&A, and fortunately we have 3 people with us today who are what my daughter calls pwaks. You know that expression? P-W-A-K-S, pwaks. People who actually know stuff. And they are Sapna, who's university architect responsible for preservation, Oleg Lobykin, a sculptor who's done much of the brilliant repair and restoration work on the campus, and Julie Harden, who's executive director in the School of Humanities and Sciences, and worked on a lot of things, the balustrades in front and all of that. So questions about how you preserve, restore, protect are precious sandstone I'm going to ask the experts to field. And Julia? Jonathan, but Julia raised her hand. Oh, Julia wants to ask a question. So Jonathan has a mic, and Charlotte has a mic. So if you want to ask a question, raise your hand.
Can you hear me? Thank you, Charlie. I apologize, I was late, so I missed the introduction. But I was in the History Corner Room 2 12 years ago or whatever it was when you first did this talk, which you've expanded on and made so much. How many others heard Charlie do this the first time? And it was, you don't often get the experience of getting to repeat the joy that a talk can give, but it brought it all back. And it was such a memory for me that when the Office of Development had a gathering of all employees in April and wanted some kind of history that would, offer our new employees a chance, I remembered this talk and I asked Charlie if he would dust it off and come to speak at OOD Connects. And thankfully, Leslie had the wisdom to say, why don't we just bring it back in addition to OOD? Why don't we bring it back so that we could actually have not just an iTunes recording, but actually one of now our video recordings. So I'm just so grateful that this is now permanently in the archive. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for making me feel 20 years younger for a few months anyway.
Hi, Charlie.
Hi.
Did Andy Goldsworthy use any of the university stone in Stone River, or did he only use it from the quarry? Did he use any of the boneyard stone?
His stones all came from the boneyard. Yeah. And I thought somebody would ask, and somebody might be wondering, did they come from Loma Prieta or from 1906? I'm not sure I can answer that question. But the boneyard was overwhelmingly 1906. And they were all spolia, Stanford spolia.
Yes.
Louder, please.
What was the main difference between Mr. Stanford and Mrs. Stanford's architectural, structural buildings? Why one fell down so much and the others kind of survived? Was she skimming it, or was he really into the structural
I'm not sure I can answer that. If maybe Sapna, would you? I think the question is, why was it that under Leland's, set of responsibilities, the buildings held up, and when Jane started building, they got flimsy.
So when Leland was actually building the buildings, only the inner quadrangle was built, which is, as you know, much shorter. And when Jane started building, a lot more ambitious, much more taller. And I like to always say the earthquake was very judicious in what it brought down.
Good taste, destruction.
Bringing all the stone from San Jose must have been a big undertaking. Can you tell us a little bit about actually the transportation process? So you suggested that he built a rail line from San Jose up to Palo Alto, Mayfield, or where was it? Or did it come on campus? Or did they have trucks running back and forth between University Avenue and here all day long for years?
As I understand, and you three can confirm or not my understanding, that the spur went right up to the building site.
On Panama Mall.
On Panama Mall, yeah. Not Bonaire siding. We think that, well, that's where the train would have come. And that would have been some distance, but the spur came right up to the site. Leslie?
Yeah, Charlie, we have some questions that have come from our online attendees, and one is, does the name Sand Hill Road have any association with the sandstone?
I don't think so. I've never heard that.
I'm going to need some help with this question because it has to do with other material that was being moved around the Stanford campus. And I remember going to a historical society presentation when Frost Amphitheater was when the renovation was completed, and what I recall, and you can please elaborate or correct me, is that the soil that had to be excavated when this construction was going on was being taken to a side of the campus land and dumped. And at some point, someone decided that that pile of sand, by excavating a little, not sand, sorry, soil, excavating below it and berming it up around the end, could become a frost amphitheater. So does anybody remember the specifics of that story? Because Sonny was there at that presentation. It was the Stanford Historical Society and the architects who supervised the supervision.
Looks as though Sapna might have an answer for you.
So you're accurate about the recollection that frost amphitheater's berms are from the earth that was excavated below the Memorial Auditorium. So that is true.
Memorial Auditorium, and then brought to frost. Glad you're here. So one question, maybe go ahead, but I'll squeeze in a question that some people who were planning to join us on Zoom sent in as a pre-question, right? And one of them was about restoration of damaged sandstone, right? And Oleg and Julie and Sapna all have deep experience with this. And I have one photograph that I think is kind of intriguing, so maybe I'll open it up and then we'll circle back to you, okay, for your question. This was after Loma Prieta. Well, here's and Oleg will be able to explain this, patch job down below, see these? One vulnerability, one susceptibility of sandstone is erosion or spalling from exposure to water. The sandstone actually dissolves. And those of you who have been on campus for years remember seeing that all around at the bases of columns, that spalling. And when I first gave this talk, Julie remembers, back in whatever year that was, I went around campus and took some pictures of spalling because I wanted to open up this topic of restoration. And I could take dozens. This time, in preparation for the talk tonight, I walked around campus. I couldn't find a single place where there's spalling. And I think it's the credit to these preservationists who have done a beautiful job of patching in here. You can see on the base of these columns and there. Now, I'll stop in a second, but this is what I wanted to show you, that in Loma, I believe this is the case, with the Loma Prieta damage, there was so much damage, whole columns needed to be replaced. And the Greystone Quarry was closed, and there was no easy source of sandstone to match our sandstone. So the solution was to create columns out of precast concrete, right? And it's a pretty good match. And what do you call that, Oleg, the scoring on that?
If you look at all architectural details, elements, they all have tool marks on them. And I think it's actually not just craftsmen. It's definitely was done under guidance of architects because they knew the interplay between the shadow and light will affect the final look. And next time when you're on campus, when you're walking in, take a look close to those marks. They actually, most of them, they're different in size. There's different teeth chisels have been used, but most of it, it's done, well, not everything on site, but some of it. And talking about column body, I think actually some of them have been replaced by precast with only one reason, because Stanford did go about 30, 40 years ago under large retrofitting project, thinking about future and future earthquakes. So it was reinforced. And why original sandstone columns, some of them were removed. Precast, those precast columns actually, they're hollow inside and they have steel beams, which one holding weight above, and are designed now as additional structural elements which one holding the structure better. So if once more hit another earthquake, it's supposed to be actually withstand much better than it was done before. And actually also one of the reasons why collapse of stonework was so significant during earthquake, because nobody actually was ready for it or knew history about California earthquakes before. So truly, actually, even during construction, nobody was taking it in account. But after it did happen, all policies, there were definitely some changes on them to make it stronger, so it will not be same result. Yeah, and precast columns, you can see some voids. Usually they do have more bubbles from than real stone, but some of them actually are pretty good, and some of them, most of them actually, there were molds taken out from real columns and mass-produced. And yes, and again, they are hollow inside and they have steel beams.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, they match pretty well in color, don't they? And the chisel lines match, but you can identify them by the bubbles. And if you go around and look for bubbles, you'll see which are the precast and which are the actual sandstone. Thank you.
So great presentation. Thank you very much. My question is, the frieze around the arch into the memorial, into the central quad, has any piece of it been preserved?
The triumphal arch?
Yeah, the frieze around it.
Not that I'm aware of. That would be nice. And it might be that some of them survived and were the first ones to leave.
Charlie,
John?
oh, sorry.
Oh, over here.
A quick question that's sort of related to that from an online attendee, and Sapna probably would know this. Is there any interest on the part of the university to rebuild that memorial arch?
No, like I said before, the scale of that was so massive that it actually dwarfed everything around it. And in a way, the scale is much more human now with a lower arcade, and even the memorial church is much more human scale now.
Okay, yeah, Steve.
Yeah, I'd like to point out another Stanford rock that's played a part in many people's hobbies or whatever over the years. That's the church rocks. These aren't really rocks because these are tiles made by people in Italy and put on the original facade of the church, and it was blown out by the earthquake and the fall of the spire, and a lot of them were dumped in the creek. And over the last 40 years as Palo Alto's historian, I've had numerous people come in with their finds, and we now have a collection of these church rocks, and people have much larger collections in gardens and other places throughout the area.
Thanks. So Steve Steiger is a Palo Alto historian, about to move his offices into the new Palo Alto Museum. Right?
Yes, the old rock building, the medical
in a year or
clinic.
so. Yeah.
Another online attendee was curious, when Goldsworthy had the masons build the stone river, did they construct it with stones and just as they were found, or did they break the stones apart and shape it to fit the sculpture?
They shaped the stone.
They shaped the stone.
Yeah, they shaped the stone.
I'd like
Hi, Joanne.
I'd like to follow up on the question about Sand Hill Road. I've always wondered about the relation between Quarry Road and the actual quarry.
Interesting. I don't know. You guys? No?
I know there was a quarry there, and it was used to use the foundation stones as part of the building.
Where? Quarry Road. Yeah, I know where
So
Quarry Road is.
first, I'd like to thank you for this presentation. And secondly, I'd like to ask if you could tell us some more about the decisions or the decision process that ended up commissioning Goldsworthy to do this particular sculpture in this particular place.
The decision to commission Goldsworthy to make the sculpture. I don't know. All I know is that Ruth Halpern very generously approached Goldsworthy through the Haynes Gallery, I suspect, in San Francisco. And she knew that he had been building walls. He's very explicit, though. He says, this is not a wall, this is a sculpture. But she knew about the walls that took walks in the woods and thought that this would be an appropriate tribute to Gerhardt's presidency. We can all just be grateful. I don't know the details beyond that.
I always thought of you as a literary person. You've clearly been working on this forever. It's wonderful. Where did the inspiration for you come from?
Thank you, John. That's an interesting question. Actually, it came from Goldsworthy. So Goldsworthy came out to the Bay Area in 1995 and had a big exhibition at the San Jose Museum of Art. And the director of the museum wanted to have an occasion where people could come and listen to Goldsworthy and see his photographs. Takes beautiful photographs, as you all know, 4x4 transparencies, Hasselblad projection, the whole thing. And they didn't have an auditorium big enough. So she knew me. This was 95, so I guess I was at continuing studies by that time. She said, would you be interested in hosting Andy Goldsworthy? I said, sure, that sounds like fun. And so I did, and I arranged to have Memod reserved on the date when Andy was ready. And then he said, the thing is, I need a projector that's got enough throw to reach from the back of the auditorium to the screen, and it has to be a projector that can take 4x4 transparencies. Very hard to find. And so I thought, well, that'd be kind of a fun project. So I snooped around, went to Keeble and Chuckett and places like that, the professional photography shops, located a projector and got it into the auditorium. And he was so grateful. He said, it's got to be good because my dad's here. His father had come and so wanted to, came to the lecture. Anyway, to make a long story short, just about a year ago, Christy and I were with a friend up at Cliff House, which is now turned into a museum, an art museum, and Goldsworthy had an installation there, along with a lot of other people. And we were looking around, and I saw him across the room talking to one of the curators. And so I walked up, I said, Andy, I said, you probably don't remember me, Charlie Junkerman from Stanford. He said, you're the guy who got me the projector. It's like, what was that, 1995, 2020, 25 years. Wow. It was Goldsworthy, yeah. And I just, adore everything he does. So that was the inspiration.
And I've lived here, most of us have lived around here. I've been to that place on Ramona. I never noticed all this stuff. So at some point, you must have had this as a beacon that you walked around and you would see stuff just accidentally here and accidentally there.
Yeah.
Is that a fair description of your?
Yeah, that's a good description. And it was a fun project because everybody's proud of their stone. And if they want to show it to you, take you out in the backyard and show you their weird barbecue. Maybe time for one more?
Do you know, and this may be for some of our experts, about the efforts to match the original sandstone when new construction is undertaken? It seems surfaces tend to be smooth rather than deeply textured and more or less the same color.
As you can imagine, it's a painstaking and loving job of getting this color right, and we have to review it in various light conditions to make sure that the texture and the color is correct. And Charlie, what you alluded to, yes, you can look at the bubbles. That is the first phase of reconstruction. So a lot of these column shafts, which were done in concrete to imitate the sandstone, when you look at the first phase, you can see the bubbles. By the time they got to the last phase, which is closer to the church, they're perfect. They're perfect. You can't see the bubbles. And the only way that you can actually see is by seeing this vertical joint, which is visible in this picture. You can see that vertical joint. That is how you can tell that it's actually a concrete column.
That's so interesting.
Okay, I think we wrapped it up. Thank you for coming. It's been a pleasure.